What's your family story worth to you? And I'm not talking about the shiny ones that everybody knows about. I mean the buried ones, the secrets, the heartbreaks, the ones that only slipped out after a night of too much Hennessy. That's what Vietnam Story Bank is for. No polish, no rewrites, no editing, just raw, recorded, beautiful beating history. The kind that makes you sit up and hold your breath. Your father's memories of his mother's wildest dreams, your grandparents' laughter that echoes in your bones. We dig it all up, we record it, and hand it back to you, safe, untouchable, and unforgettable. Because when your stories disappear, they're gone forever. So go to VietnamStoryBank.com today and make sure your family's stories are recorded. Welcome to the Vietnamese podcast. Today we have a very different kind of podcast. I have friends that are in the anthropology business. I have Nam Si Kim, who's been on the podcast many times, and Professor John D. Phan, who has been my co-host in our sub-series of Vietnam Origins. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Kenneth.
It's great to be back. Hi, John.
Yeah,
This is
great to be here.
This is making me very nervous, to be honest with you. I'm trying to figure out, like, get that out of the way. When I think about my time as a young man in my 20s, going through USC, the anthropology department, you guys would be my future icons to explain and to walk me through the history of Vietnam. We often hear about all of these legends and these mythic stories that come out of the early days of Vietnam, whether it's 1,000 years ago or earlier. And we hear all these stories come out. And I think today we're here to really dive into what Nam has told me, many years ago about the records, this idea of the records. So what can we see and what can we learn from things in the earth? And now with John, we understand there's the records, quote unquote, the records in our linguistic tracings, where we can find out that things have moved. So we're going to really go back in time and talk about, are some of these things real? Are some of the legends that we, Oka and Long Quyen, we could probably start there as the first story, and all of these ideas about Gola and our Camelot. Are these things real?
Well, first of all, I just want to say how much of a privilege it is to be on this podcast with the both of you. Ken, you and I have done a lot of things together, and I'm honored to be on your show once again. And John, as you probably know, I've been following your work, and I've been a big fan of yours for many years. And I've learned a ton from your work. So to answer that question, that's a huge question, and it doesn't apply just to Vietnam and to Vietnamese history. It applies anywhere really in the world. When we talk about legends, right, mythical tales, how much of it might be rooted in reality? I think that as a kind of generic answer, there's always some element of veracity in some of these stories because they come from somewhere, and they usually incorporate parts of knowledge and history from a long time ago. And some of those histories maybe weren't written down, maybe they were passed on through oral traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's plenty of archaeological and anthropological research about this, if you're interested, from many parts of the world, about how oral traditions are actually quite accurate in describing events, environments, things that existed thousands of years in the past. So I'll preface by saying that because we know this, it's quite possible that many of the folktales that we hear about for Vietnamese culture have veracity. That being said, there are elements that we can point to and say, well, that might be hard to believe, right? So if there are supernatural events, or if there are, stories about magical occurrences, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. But if we start getting into some of those stories, I think depending on how far back we're going and what is actually being described, there are intriguing ways to use records. And when we say records, I'm not talking about just history. I'm talking about the material record to try to validate or substantiate elements of those stories.
Mhm.
And for Vietnam, I you know, I can't speak to the deeper recesses of history. The time period that I work in, as you know, is the first millennium BCE. And here we have a mixture of legends as well as archaeology and text within that millennium. And so that's where I'm comfortable talking a little bit more. But if we're going back to the dragon and the mountains and the seas and all that, I can't comment on that.
Okay, yeah, I agree with everything that Nam said. First, I also would like to say it's great to sit down with both of you here. It's been such fun doing the Viet Origins sub-series with Kenneth and Nam. I've also been a huge fan of yours. I teach your book every year in my class, so it's great to sit down in the podcast together to discuss this stuff. This question about like, are our legends real? I think the first, one thing I say in my classes all the time, just to echo part of what Nam said, is that like there's a difference between historical veracity and what you would call real. Like the legends are definitely real in the sense that they play a role in Vietnamese culture. They're part of Vietnamese identity. Like, was Jesus born on the 25th of December? Like, did King Arthur exist? Like, these are separate questions than the role that they play in the culture that they inhabit. So Lạc Long Quân, Oka, Hùng Kings, all of that is real in the sense that it is truly part of Vietnamese culture. But the way in which it became part of Vietnamese culture is very complicated. And the relationship between the way in which these cultural traditions emerged, the relationship between that and actual historical events is even more complicated. So if you wanted to start with, Oka and Lạc Long Quân, that story, I agree, and I want to emphasize what Nam said about the oral tradition as a kind of historical record. My advisor Keith Taylor did a lot of that work, and it's super important. And so I'm emphasizing that as a caveat to say we're never really sure. There's always this possibility that something was transmitted orally across these generations that has a more ancient provenance than we can really point to with like something explicit like the textual or material record. But from the textual perspective, the Oka and Lạc Long Quân story, like so many of our stories that are important to us, is really a 15th century story. And I would say one thing about this story, it is definitely part of the 15th century political situation, which was a very important moment in Vietnamese history. The Vietnamese kingdom had just come out of 20 years of Ming occupation. So there's a very specific social, cultural, and political moment. And there's this huge production of stories as a result of that takes older stories and reworks them. That said, as Keith Taylor and Lee Tanan and I think Oscar Salamik as well, rest in peace, may have mentioned, there's an older current to that Lạc Long Quân and Oka story that has to do with other stories we might talk about today, which is the contrast or the relationship between the highlands and the lowlands. So Lạc Long Quân is a water deity. He's a water dragon. Oka is a mountain spirit. She's a fairy or an immortal, but associated with the mountains or the highlands, or at least something that's contrasting with the lowland or the wetland. So there's a kind of, you can detect a more ancient contrast between the highlands and the lowlands that we see in other stories like Sơn Tinh Thủy Tinh, for example. And that might be this thing, I think, that Nam is pointing out. Like, it might be a kind of cultural memory that survives through oral tradition that then is reinterpreted and composed into a new story in the 15th century.
John, there was so much in what you said that I've been writing down things and I wanted to respond to them because it's fascinating. And by the way, this is really, really fun for me because I've had separate conversations with both of you about a lot of these kinds of topics. And so to have this now in this space with the three of us, this is great. This is a lot of fun. But what you were talking about, John, that I really appreciated was how these stories have been curated by different communities and different societies for various reasons, various cultural motivations, various political motivations. And clearly they come from a very deeper ancient space, but they continue to echo across centuries, across millennia.
Mhm.
And as they echo, they're going through this sort of game of telephone, right? Where
Yeah.
people change, maybe they add or they subtract details, and they reflect the times that they're living in at that moment. And it kind of suits whatever purposes they might have had.
Exactly.
But I like what you also said about this contrast between upland and lowland, because the topography has not changed. The
Mhm.
geographies are similar. And it's quite likely that the kinds of societies that inhabited those spaces would have had perceptions about these environments, about what it means to live in the Delta, what it means to farm, right? Wet rice farming, what it means to have certain kinds of environments versus other environments where you have different kinds of subsistence practices. Then maybe there are sorts of cultural perceptions about this. We're civilized, we do farming, you don't, right?
Yeah.
And maybe those kinds of perceptions bleed into the political as well. And so whatever we see in the sorts of medieval periods of Vietnamese history or in the modern might have been going on many, many centuries prior to that as well. It's just
Mhm.
different players and different actors. But the situations might have been kind of analogous. But the larger thrust of this is, there's an agency to those stories because they do persist and they take on these different meanings and lives of their own as generated by the people who are receiving them and spreading them and using them.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating and super interesting, and I agree. One of the I have two simultaneous thoughts. So the first thought is that um, it's amazing how a structure like highland versus lowland, something that can persist and be a kind of linkage between the way we think about things or the way we perceive things or the stories we tell in this century versus that century. And it's also amazing how very different, as you say, the actors or the people in these particular spaces can change. So, just over the lip of a mountain for X century would have been perceived as savage, and then, just a little bit later, that is a center of culture and civilization, even though it's a little high or a little low, so like the capacity for humans to change the geography that they live in is also, very powerful.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that as we start to talk about these stories, the specific stories and their relationship to the material or linguistic or historical record, I think the other capacity I just want to emphasize again is how much we are only paying attention to in a given moment what we care about, or like how a set of facts relates to our particular time,
Yeah.
and it's always good to remember things like how different a particular figure is viewed. So, like for example, the Trung sisters for so many centuries were savages, and then they become heroines, and someone like Ma Yuan or someone like Zhao Tuo is for so many centuries an ancestor or like a venerated figure, and then turns out to be an invader at a certain point. So, the capacity for humans to rewrite our own stories is basically limitless, so that
Yeah.
really, yeah, that's what I want to say. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about that? So,
Yeah.
I don't know that much about how these perceptions and
Mhm.
of these historical figures have changed and when they have changed. So
Yeah.
you mentioned something that I find very interesting: the view of Haiba Chung as savages and then becoming heroines, and vice versa when we're
Mhm.
talking about Zhao Tuo and
Yeah.
Ma Viet, right?
Yeah.
Um, when does that happen, and
Yeah.
how does
Well,
that shift take place?
yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say, well, if you're asking specifically about Haibacheng, so the first thing I will say is that the idea that they have been venerated as like freedom fighters is not even a 15th century invention. It's like a modern invention. The idea that they are representatives in the long line of Vietnamese freedom fighters is a very modern phenomenon for sure. And one way to track this is to look at who is um, worshipped, who is worshipped as a figure.
Mhm.
And Ma Yuan is the one that's worshipped, for a long time. And especially if you look at someone like Xin Shixie, although this is a little speculatory because, Shixie had left no writings that talked specifically about how he felt about the Trung sisters or Ma Yan. Like certainly as a Confucian governor of the Han, who is trying to maintain order as the Han dynasty is falling, though he is, I think, a sixth generation Zhaoqi person, those things are not in contrast for him. And for him, I think it's very safe to speculate that he would have culturally felt much closer to Ma Yan than to the Trung sisters. The Trung sisters would have been an example of unrest for him,
Mm.
and Ma Yan would have been an example of someone who restores order in his
Yeah.
personal culture. And even when we get to Li Chan dynasties, figures like Jiu Das and Ma Bian are the ones that are venerated. Now the Trung sisters, as you pointed out, there's evidence that the Trung sisters survived in a cult worship.
Right.
Yeah, and the Chung sisters are also that cult is also represented. There's like a lot of Southeast Asian like twin female or like sisters cults, and it seems like the Chung sisters might fit into a broader worship of that type.
Yeah.
But they're not state heroes. They're powerful spirits, and that's a totally different kind of that
Right.
they're changed into a state hero later on. Yeah.
Okay. So that's actually part of my follow-up question.
Oh.
When you say venerated and maybe castigated or viewed negatively,
Mhm.
there's a sort of monolithic perspective here that maybe is borne by the state as opposed to we're not talking about everybody within the Red River Delta
For sure.
potentially, right? We're looking at different communities of people who have probably very different views about whether they should be governed by this entity or not governed,
Mhm.
if they should be independent, or whatever the case might have been. And so
Yeah.
there might have been different communities that had very different ideas about the role that the Trung sisters had played.
Yeah, 100%. I think that it's a really, really important point. We're not talking about a single society, but I do think that when sometimes this idea is raised with the like a little sneaking, idea that maybe that like the real Vietnamese are like these peasants who worship Hai Ba Ching and don't worship Ma Bien. And that just emerges as like the true Vietnamese culture by the modern period. And I would argue against that idea because actually the people who create the modern cult of Hai Ba Ching as freedom fighters are part of the political elite.
I see.
And they have, and it's exactly the transformation of the political elite that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So like different popular cults exist and they have always existed, I think, to Nam's point, in a great diversity of forms of worship. But I think, and this is my favorite soapbox, as Kenneth knows. Like the mission to identify what is truly Vietnamese and what is truly Chinese going back centuries is, I think, a really poisonous thing. Like we keep on confusing ourselves by doing that. And like very often, those lines cross over and over and over again, like over history. And this example that it's the political elite who are enshrining Hai Ba Ching in the 19th and 20th centuries is a good example of that. It's not like these villagers in the rural hinterland that all of a sudden say, no, this is what we've been worshiping all along and this needs to be enshrined.
Yeah.
And in fact, in many of those areas, one would speculate, I think with great credibility, that there, alongside Hai Ba Ching, there's cults to Jiu Da, there's cults to Ma Bian, there's all these types of cults. And the real difference is that in like the Huang Tang, the kind of local tutelary god kind of worship, they're not political. They're thought of as powerful spirits. They're thought of powerful protective spirits. And the moment when those enter into the political realm is the Chun dynasty. That in the Chun, when the Viet Yin U Linh Tap is written, because the Mongols are invading, so the king goes around to all these little cults, and then he's like, who is the most powerful spirit in this area? And if they're that powerful, let's give them an official title and bring them into the spiritual service of the empire or the kingdom, because we're under this massive attack. So
Yeah.
I mean the diversity. Yeah.
This is so interesting. So the reality is Hai Ba Ching come from a source that is almost politicized.
right? Like much later, and they were savages before, and all of a sudden they become heroes or deity or people that like the script is completely flipped.
Yeah, well, I mean, it, I guess I want to say one thing. Like, Nam's point is really right. Like, they are savages from a particular perspective, and that is the perspective of cynic rulers of the region, right? Um, and at the same time as they are viewed as I would maybe not savages, but like rebels, you know. So like in the list of the great leaders of the area, like when you get to the Li Jian and Lei dynasty, they're not listed, but Zhao Tou is listed, Ma Vian is listed, Si Niep is listed. Those types of people are listed, but Hai Bacheng are not listed. But in Viet, in Uling Tap, there's a story of them. You know, the story is recorded there, and it probably does correlate to some kind of persistent cult. And the kernel of that story, as with many of those stories, isn't that they fought for the freedom of Vietnam. It's that there was a great, violence and a great kind of emotional, a spiritual sort of set of events that had spiritual potency, and for that reason, they seem to linger and have an effect in the area. You know, so all of the stories in Viet in Uling Tap, even when they overlap with political stories like Ang Dung Vuong, etc., the thing that really gets them to be a cult is that there's some kind of spiritual potency, some kind of tragedy, you know, some deeply emotional spiritual thing that then persists, you know, like you can think of them as ghost stories, you know, like Unfinished Business or something like that gives them the platform to become this spiritual figure, you know, and that's like a very different thing. It speaks exactly to what Nam was saying about the difference, like the different communities that are thinking about worshiping or interacting with these figures, and the one almost has nothing to do with the other, you know. Yeah.
So this is fascinating to me, and I guess one observation or question is, if they are viewed as rebels by certain entities or certain parties, right? Maybe by those that are in control. The fact that, and I don't know how accurate these details are, but it seems as though when they led the uprising, they attack many, I mean, dozens apparently of strongholds and citadels and destroy them. And my suspicion then is, for those that are part of that endeavor, they're viewed as leaders and heroes because they are leading this rebellion against an oppressive force.
Yeah.
And so there are probably many kinds of perspectives about them, and different people have different ideas of what they're doing and whether it's legitimate or illegitimate.
Yeah.
But I can see how that, like any political time you're living in, things are always going to be complicated with various viewpoints. But one of the things I wanted to ask about then is, how much of those details can we put stock into? So what do the texts say about what they actually did? And what do we think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would like, you know, this is one of the things I want to talk to Nam about, because this is a place where I think both Nam and I have thought a lot about the correlation between the historical and material record. Because the material record, I know, Nam, you've worked so much on the material record of Gola just before this moment, and then, you know, and then this moment as well. So I'd love to hear what the material record says about this moment.
Yeah.
The historical record for Hai Bacheng is way better than the historical record for An Dung Vuong and Gola. You know, Gola is not even named until many centuries later, but the Trung Sisters are named in the Han record. So we have an almost contemporaneous, you know, like, you know, it's written later, but it is as close almost as we can get to the event.
Yeah.
And we have two accounts of it, you know, in the Book of Later Han. So we have account of it in like sort of the Barbarian Treatise, which is about the Trung Sisters themselves, and then we have an account of it in Ma Yuan's biography. Okay. So two versions of the story, and they corroborate with one another very well.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, with any of these historical records, obviously this is something that's written slightly later based on primary text. So the way we understand it is that they had maybe memorials and commands and accounts, and then that is compiled and then rewritten into the historical record.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it is a very valuable record and almost in the time. And the details are pretty clear. Like as Nam, as you said, they do overrun many commanderies, all the way up into, out both south and north of the Red River Plain. And then the other really important detail I think to mention is that when they're defeated, Ma Yuan kills thousands of people. Like he kills a huge number of the leadership of whatever this rebellion is.
Yeah.
And that's the point I want to emphasize, because when we think about a story like this, going back to the early part of our conversation, I think there's two things to bear in mind. One is that the architecture of the story can mean different things to us in different moments of time. And that means we can identify with different actors in the story depending on who we are and in what time we're living. So in X time, maybe we're identifying with the people who are being attacked by Hai Ba Jing.
Right.
And in another time, maybe all of a sudden we're like, no, we are Hai Ba Jing,
Right.
So like, are you Luke Skywalker or are you Darth Vader? It depends on where you are in your life. Maybe you're identifying with one or the other.
Right.
And I think there's a tendency always to think that who the Vietnamese identified with, and you can't see me because this is a podcast, but I'm putting Vietnamese in scare quotes, like who the Vietnamese identify with in that story is consistent over the centuries of history, and it's not. That's the main point I'm trying to make.
Right. Yeah.
And many Vietnamese of different classes would not have identified with Hai Ba Jing, in large tracts of history.
Sure.
And the other point I want to make, and this is where I want to ask some questions about the material record, because Nam, you and I have talked about Catherine Churchland's work a lot, but the evidence of the Đông Sơn material record after the 1st century, in the 2nd century, 3rd centuries, and this is where I would like Nam, I'd love Nam for you to speak more about what happens to that record, because as far as I understand it, it does basically disappear or move north and east. And that poses a really important question about what happens to the society of the Red River Plain after the Trung Sisters rebellion.
Yeah.
We always, the nationalist story is that they are Vietnamese and the Vietnamese persist in that region. But then we have historical and potentially a material indication that whatever society that they represented, the elite of that society is essentially eradicated. So what I'd like to ask Nam about is what does the material record say about Đông Sơn material elite culture, like in the centuries following the Han suppression of the rebellion?
Yeah. Okay. I want to answer your question, but I also want to talk a little bit more about what you've just said, because there's a lot to absorb here. The short answer for the question about Đông Sơn material culture is that we do see elements persisting.
Right.
So, there's this idea, there are a couple of ideas where folks have pointed to the annexation of the Red River Delta area at the ascribed date of 111 BCE by the Han. But the reality from the material record is just because they describe this in text doesn't mean that actually things change all that much at 111.
Right.
We do see persistence of daily lifeways, cultural lifeways that had been there for generations prior. We see them persisting for generations subsequent to that. So that doesn't seem to be a major turning point.
Right. Not 111, right? But
not 111.
The Trung Sisters is in 43, right? So it's later.
So we're talking now in the next century, or the next 2 centuries later, there does seem to be more of a sea change at that point.
Yeah.
And it appears, it doesn't appear that things change completely overnight, because my understanding of the material record, at least for parts of Bac Bo, is that the Đông Sơn cultural practices don't disappear. They continue. They persist. There is a growing kind of hybrid culture, if you want to call it that. Yeah. The Han Viet or Viet Han kinds of cultural practices, and we see this reflected in Han brick tombs,
right,
where you have a mixture of material culture, not only Han sorts of culture, but also local Đông Sơn culture as well, what we might
Right.
call Vedic culture.
Yeah.
Those, it might be just a certain class of folks, and it might be maybe the elites. But I think that maybe what we could say is that those that are sort of higher status or in power, political power, with the suppression of that rebellion, either they're killed, they're scattered, or they move away.
Right.
And we have descriptions about the general, the great pacifier of the South, Ma Viet, confiscating symbols of authority and power, like the bronze drum.
Mhm.
So if that's actually all true and that's happening, there is a change at the top. But with the local communities, how much does life change immediately? That I'm not sure about. And I suspect, because the persistence of the Đông Sơn materials, that doesn't change all that much, at least not right away.
Yeah. Can I ask you what the specific materials are that are found that persist? Because what I understand is that the elite artifacts, things like drums, we do find a few drums afterwards, and some I think with Chinese characters as well, but that the main production of drums moves to the hilly region between the Red and Pearl rivers, and essentially out of the Red River Plain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that right? So what are the kinds of objects that you do find, say, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries that you would consider Domsonian?
Yeah. I don't know that record quite as well. And I would preface this by saying that I don't think, when I hear my colleagues in Vietnam talking about it, I don't think it goes on to the 4th century.
Okay.
Most people who are referring to it, I think, are referring to more utilitarian kinds of items, and maybe bronzes as well, that are sort of part of the typical Đông Sơn assemblage. Various kinds of farming implements and maybe hunting implements, utilitarian tools.
Yeah.
Maybe styles of pottery. But those, I don't think folks talk about the 4th century. I think 1st and 2nd century Common Era, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
I'd have to do more research to know how to answer that question more specifically.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And it's interesting because I had a thought. So 1st, 2nd centuries makes perfect sense to me. When I think about it, I 100% agree with what you said. And I think even the historical record bears out what you're saying from the material record with regard to the initial conquest. So, I mean, conquest should be in scare quotes, because the thing that was conquered in 111 BCE is Nam Viet. It's not the Red River Plain specifically. And the Red River Plain is kind of left to its own devices. The other detail in the Trung Sisters rebellion story that is worth noting is that the impetus for the rebellion is that Toding, the governor, entangles Trung Trec with laws. So she's angry about some kind of administrative legal thing. So that means what that really suggests to me is that between 111 BCE and 40 CE, the Han are just slowly, increasingly, pervasively present, starting to change laws, change customs. And in 40, Trung Trec is like, what the hell is going on? This is unacceptable. And that's the beginning. So you really do see a slow process between 111 and 40. And then if you go from 40 to 200, like to Siniip's time, you see another, like a more rapid sort of sinification of the region.
Yeah.
And, Li Tana, we're getting a little in the weeds, but Li Tana describes that period as the period in which really Zhaoti becomes the important Han port city.
Okay.
So like it becomes the richest southern port of the Han in that time. So it makes a lot of sense to me to see a change in the material record in exactly those centuries.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to mention is that with regard to daily life, like if you look at the linguistic record, I've worked on this, and Mark Alvis has worked a lot on this as well. Early Sino-Vietnamese is what we call it. Like early Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary. Well, let me back up and say Mark has done excellent work about vocabulary that he believes indicates a consistency with Đông culture, vocabulary around canoes. And Michel Ferlus has done work on the word pestle and some other things. But at the same time, there's no need for a but. And at the same time, we see a lot of technological vocabulary in early Sino-Vietnamese, like axe, hammer, things like that. So we do see, like in the linguistic record also, interpenetration of Sinitic and non-Sinitic. even at this kind of basic level, not just at the elite level.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to imagine over those centuries, not just an elite ruling Han class, but like a true sort of demographic shift.
Yeah.
In the entire region of the lowland.
Yeah. So I think that's an important point. And my understanding is after that significant date of 43, and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there then an influx of folks from the north that are coming down and settling in this area? And so beyond the changes at the top, beyond the changes of the elites and the political figures, now we have the everyday folks, the commoners that are intermingling with different populations that are coming in from elsewhere. And so that might be behind the major changes that are starting to happen.
Yeah, Keith Taylor has theorized that the militia that Ngo Quyen raised basically stayed.
Okay.
They stayed in the region, and then there are refugees from a rebellion, and then that happens over. And when Siniip is in charge, 150 years later, as the Han Dynasty is falling into the Three Kingdoms, we have historical indication that his reign was so peaceful that people from all over the empire flocked to Zhaoqi. So then you get another, yet another wave. So there's wave after wave after wave of people coming down into Zhaoqi.
So I'm curious about something. And we started talking about this a few minutes ago. And sorry, Ken, I know we're dominating this conversation.
We get carried away.
I think that's why we're here.
Okay.
It's to watch this rabbit hole. We're tearing down the rabbit hole, and I'm fascinated.
I don't get a chance to ask John all these questions.
Same, Nam. There's so few of us working on the first millennium that when we get together, it's like. It's a little too fun. We get carried away.
We could go on for hours, for days.
I think that's what the audience is here to really witness. The diehards that follow John. I think they're having a good. I'm because I'm having a good time. So
okay. All right.
Yeah. We should get to those legends eventually, but
yeah. So let's talk a little. Let's start getting into that. So I want to ask. We talked earlier about these commanderies, these citadels that were attacked and razed during this rebellion and over the course of a few years, right? I'm curious how much textual detail there might be about this. Do we have specific places? Do we have specific names? Do we have a list? Because as an archaeologist, to me, this is fertile ground. And I don't know if anybody's actually done this. I don't know. When I ask my colleagues in Vietnam about the archaeology of this time period, about Hai Bát Trung specifically, I'm told, well, in one part of Vietnam, not that far west from Hanoi, there is, I think in the Mê Linh area, there are the remains of an earthen rampart, right? That people speculate are part of maybe the citadel that's associated with their headquarters or something like that. But aside from that, I haven't heard any discussion. And the reason I bring this up is because we can point to legends and folk tales and history elsewhere in the world, actually, that are eerily similar. So we go back to that first century. We talk about Boudica or Boudicca in the United States.
I always talk about Boudica and the Trung Sisters in my class. That's hilarious.
Because it's the same century. They lead an uprising against the Roman Empire. And we see actual archaeological evidence of it. Because there are at least 2 settlements that Boudica purportedly destroys. She leads her army and destroys them. And if you look at the archaeological excavations of those areas, people have pointed out you can actually see a destruction horizon, which they associate with that event. So it makes me wonder, can we do the same thing in Vietnam?
First, I just think that's so awesome that you mentioned Boudica, because I literally, like, when we talk about Trung Sisters and Siniip, I mentioned Boudica, Anglo-Romantic culture, I think that's the term, for this, sort of hybridized culture that arises in the lower part of the British Isles, and then King Arthur, because King Arthur is so similar to Siniip, like as a kind of hybridized figure who is then remembered as a kind of, succeeding in creating stability in otherwise really unstable times. So like, and it is, as you mentioned, so almost contemporaneous, like almost exactly contemporaneous. It's nuts, like the parallels. But for your specific question, I might, I need to go back to confirm what I'm about to say, but the Han map of the region of the Red River Plain is very unclear until after the Trung Sisters. So that we do have like the major three commanderies, right? We have in the area, and we presume in each of those commanderies presumably has a citadel, And then, as you said, there's a number of citadels that are mentioned, like the number, not the names, but the number of citadels is mentioned. And we do have names of places like that from all of Giao Thi region, which stretches from central Vietnam all the way to the Pearl River. So we do have indication that there are walled towns. And actually, there's even an earlier reference. So if you go back to Nan Yue time. So the reason why before the Trung Sisters we have a less good view of the Han is because it was Nan Yue, and the Han did not have an internal map of Nan Yue. So all that we have is the Han's understanding of Nan Yue, which is not that good. And all that we have from that is that there were walled towns. There were walled towns, or fortified cities, I guess, whatever you want to call it, across that region. And then that is combined with the census. So the Han census is very clear, and the Han census makes it very clear that the demographic center is of the entire Giao Chi region, from Pearl River down to central Vietnam, is Red River Plain. Like Red River Plain is much, much more heavily populated than anywhere else in the area.
Right.
So that would suggest, that then if there are walled cities, there's going to be more of those in that area. But this makes me raise it, because I know you work. I mean, I love your book, that especially your work on Gola particularly. So I want to ask you a lot of questions about Gola. But of course, one of the huge mysteries for me is, why is there no mention of Gola in the Han record? And the Trung Sisters do not set themselves up at Gola. They go a little further to Mei Ling. I mean, there's all sorts of things we could say. Maybe Gola was razed to the ground at this time, then that's a real possibility. But I would love to hear you talk about, and let me, before I pose the question, I will say there's lots of there in the 6th century we get like references to what probably is Gola. It's not called Gola, but it's like Viet Thuong Citadel, or sometimes it's called Khado Citadel. Like there's some kind of citadel there that's probably Gola, but not until 6th century. And so, you mentioned the Mei Ling site, and we know from the historical record that is where the Trung Sisters set up their court. So I just wonder, has anyone done a kind of material comparison between Mei Ling area and the Gola area? Because I would love to hear, because I know from your book, really just from your book, that there's all these crossbows and crossbow triggers and even molds for those weapons in Gola. But what about, further up into Mei Ling?
Yeah.
And how do you understand the difference between those two sites from the material record is the real question.
Okay. Before I answer your question, I have more questions.
The crazy thing about this episode is, what I'm realizing is how little cross-referencing is happening within the anthropology field in Vietnam.
Well, I mean, we get little chances to like, I'll reuse the word again, to chém gió with each other, like we're doing now, which is the thing that is like the funnest. But I think we use each other. I mean, like Nam, your book is all over my book. Like everything that has to do with Gola is basically from Nam's book in my book. So we do, I think, use each other.
Yeah, there's no question. Our research benefits from each other, but the opportunities for us to sit down like this and just exchange, that's rare. And so Ken, I think your larger point about how few interactions, or how it's true to some extent, but all the people that John has sort of referenced throughout this conversation, I know their work as well, and it's very important work for me. And so we all kind of know each other, but how much we get to collaborate, that's a different story. Like we would love to collaborate. I mean, I would love to collaborate with John. And actually, this question I have about the Trung Sisters raises an interesting possibility, right? If we were to hypothetically come up with a project where let's try to find the material correlates for some of these events. So these historical descriptions about the sites that were part of these stories, these histories, where they occurred, what sites were attacked, maybe we can find a way to marry the historical evidence with a search for the material correlates. And we do this as a sort of large-scale international collaboration with our colleagues in Vietnam.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing stuff on the wall here, but to me, that would be fascinating.
I'd love that. And that's why I wish you were coming in the spring now. We're trying to get a collaborative conference together, and I hope we'll be part of it in some way. Also, this is a total non sequitur, but the other reason we can't get together is we have no funding. So if you're listening, please do drop $1, drop $2 for us. Every cent counts. Thank you so much. Okay, sorry, Kenneth, go ahead.
Thanks, John. I do have a question about this direction to kind of come together. You all researchers put it all together. But now I'm wondering how the Vietnamese government would feel about the things that you would like stake in the ground and say, this is what we're coming up with. How would they feel? Would they be on board with what you are saying? Or will there be some real pushback?
Well, for me, I think it depends. It depends on which histories you're talking about, which archaeological sites you're talking about. Because Vietnam is not just one person, right? It's not just one entity. You've got different provinces, you've got different authorities, and different viewpoints about how history should be preserved, how it should be presented, how it should be researched. What are the kinds of questions you should be asking? How do you prioritize that? How do you invest funding for it? And how do you put things into museums and encourage people to come and learn? All that's going to depend on the specific history, the specific time period, and the specific materials. That being said, I can only speak to my experience directly. Excavating at Gola. So I wasn't sure what the reaction was going to be when I first got to Hanoi, 20 years ago as a graduate student, asking about possible collaborations between American archaeologists and Vietnamese archaeologists. And what I found was my local colleagues, even though we had just met, they were very open to collaboration and they were open to different kinds of questions. We might not have the same kinds of theoretical priorities, but where we do overlap, there's plenty of room for collaboration and differences in opinion and interpretation. So, for example, when I proposed working at Gola specifically, I was interested in anthropological theories about early governments and early states and how war might be part of that sort of development process. My colleagues weren't as interested in those questions, right? They weren't interested in the early forms of urbanism in mainland Southeast Asia. What they were interested in was Anzengweng real? Was there an Olak kingdom? How does the site prove, how does the archaeology of the site prove what they thought they already knew, right? So those are different kinds of questions, but we had to look at the same site and we had to excavate the same place and we had to get material data out of the ground to address the kinds of questions we all respectively had. So from that standpoint, to answer the question you just posed, Ken, I think they would be open. I mean, it all depends on how you couch the research itself. If you came in and said, I'm looking for the material proof that the Han constructed the walls of Gola, if that's how you led, right? I'm not sure you would have a lot of support locally. But I would say that if you have mutual interests, there's plenty of potential for collaboration. I don't know, John, if you have a different perspective on this.
Yeah, no, I think that was really well put. I agree 100%. I think it goes back to the fact that, like we were talking about earlier, like you have to separate like cultural and political reality from historical veracity. And you can't be a bully about that. Like like Vietnamese culture is real. You have to respect it. Like you have to like, you can't go in, you're like being a bully about historical factuality to the disregard of contemporary Vietnamese culture. And I think that that is a really important thing. And it's not, as Nam, you put it earlier, it's not something that just applies to Vietnam. It's just polite, like for anyone in the world. It's just like a thing that you ought to do anywhere in the world. And I think my experience has been the same. Like and I say some inflammatory things in my book about Sinitic or Vedic identity, but like my experience, talking about the contents of my book in Vietnam has been incredibly positive. Like if you're not trying to be insulting, I think that, especially the scholarly community is brilliant and creative and cutting edge and open to collaboration. And yeah, you don't need to pick a fight. Like it's not necessary. And there's plenty of space, where between our objectives, where there is so much overlap for collaboration. My book is being translated. I am curious how it's going to be received once it is fully readable in Vietnamese, but because there is I guess, even though I said what I just said, there is always some discomfort, right? Because with any kind of deep digging, you do confront sort of assumptions about your own past and your own identity that are maybe deeply held, and it's not comfortable to hold a paradox in your mind. It's not comfortable to be raised a devout Christian, and not only a devout Christian, but someone who truly believed as a child that the 25th was Jesus's birthday, and then to learn about the historical Jesus, and then like that's difficult. It's, I think, important and necessary. And to push the analogy, it doesn't necessarily need to lead to a crisis of faith. You don't have to stop being a Christian because you learn more about the historical Jesus. It could in fact have the opposite effect. And that's what I say in my classes all the time. Like, we are breaking down national identity in our class, but in the end, I hope that it will deepen, your appreciation for Vietnamese identity and culture. But it is uncomfortable and it's difficult. And so there are always moments along that pathway that there's the potential for kind of that discomfort.
Yeah.
But I would welcome
point.
that. Yeah.
That's a really good point, John. This whole, I maybe years ago I learned that before the actual cyclical side of the birth of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, and these are agricultural patterns that maybe 20 deities before Jesus Christ was institutionalized in the Catholic faith, perhaps. And you're right; it doesn't take away from my meditations of life, right? The birth and the death of Christ. To know that could have been built on many stories, 20 stories of sun gods that came from the Egyptian sort of culture, or Babylonian, whatever you name it. And I think learning more about Vietnamese culture day in and day out has also given me this perspective that things are changing, and it's okay to hold 3 or 4 different things that are different from each other, and just kind of like sit on it and think about that all competing with each other and being okay with it.
Yeah. And I think, if I can just jump in again, because you just made me have a thought, which is that, like, we were talking about how stories are reinvented over time, like, you just made me think, Ken, that, we can imagine how, like, the psychology of that moment in a very personal way, like maybe, this intellectual or that figure or that person at a different moment in history is rereading the story, and like, they're having that moment. They're like feeling uncomfortable about their own understanding of Vietnamese history or Vietnamese past. And then something when they reread it this time, it strikes them differently. It just resonates differently. And that is how culture is created or changed, right? Like, they now are reacting to that story differently and they're interpreting it differently.
Yeah.
It means something different to them. And then, that different meaning starts to spread, like, I think it's a very natural process. And when you think about it that way, then you get a sense of richness, from these stories, that I think is precious. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, I totally agree with everything both of you are saying. And I think it brings to mind how choices are being made, right?
Mhm.
So when these stories come to us and we interpret, we analyze, and then we disseminate, we're making choices because the lens that we are using is a sort of product of the time that we're living in, but it's also what we choose to promote, what we choose to bring forward and to record for posterity. That's a conscious decision, and there are certain things we're leaving out because you can't record every single detail, and you're going to promote one view versus another. Those are all conscious choices or subconscious choices. It's subjectivity that's happening, and it's unavoidable, right?
Yeah.
So it is very much a product of the time. I had a question that I want to come back to for John.
Excuse me.
Earlier, you mentioned two things, and I want to ask about those two things. One was the phrase "walled town."
Mhm.
Is that the etymology for Tang Pho, for city, right, in Vietnamese? Does that come from that idea, that concept?
The tang part does. There's another word, I think it's ba yi. I have to look it up, but tang, the tang in Tang Pho,
Yeah.
I think is essentially a walled town. As a
Okay.
town with a wall. There's like a little earth radical on the left of the
Yeah.
character. But there's another term, the term that is used in the the book of Han to describe the walled towns in Nanyue is not that term. I think
Okay.
it's ba or e, which means like mounded fortification. But I don't remember the detail exactly.
Okay.
But I can find it very easily for
Okay.
you, after this. Yeah.
Okay. So two follow-up questions then. Tang Pho, then where does that, for the entire etymology of that phrase, where does that come from? So we know about Tang, but
Yeah, I have to. This is one of those things that maybe in the fact check we're gonna have to correct later because I didn't look it up before.
No,
this.
that's fine.
But I'm pretty sure pho comes from pho is like pho gang. It's like port.
Okay.
No, pho means
Like a market?
avenue, right? I don't remember. It is a Chinese word. I just can't remember the etymology of pho at this
So,
moment.
yeah.
But yeah.
So it might be walls and streets as a sort of representation of an urban space or city.
Yeah, I mean the Chinese word.
right?
Well,
Pho
pho.
is city, and then Tang is wall, right? So city wall, city
Well,
walled city.
pho. I have to look up the etymology of pho. I don't think it is market. Is it market? I think it means like avenue.
Okay.
Like broad out. I mean, like pho, like pho hai ba jiu,
Right,
pho hai ba jiang, But I can't remember. But you're right that like the modern Chinese word for city is market and wall town. Like it's
Okay.
城市,
Right.
which is thành thị. We would say thành thị in Vietnamese.
Right. But the other one that you mentioned
right.
is the mound, right? But you
Yeah,
said
ba and
fortified mound.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is something like that. I'm pretty sure is the term in the Han Shu for when they're
Okay.
describing all of like 40 walled towns.
Yeah. I find that
Yeah.
fascinating because, as you know, my reason I got into anthropology and archaeology in the first place is preoccupation and sort of unhealthy interest in war.
Yeah.
And for me, some of the research on the earliest cities of the world, and whether or not people come together for various reasons, and if they're all walled, what does that indicate to us, right?
Right.
This idea of security, and maybe defense against outside human threat.
Mhm.
So I find it fascinating to think that some of the terminology in this part of the world, East and Southeast Asia, for some of the earliest urban spaces have to do with walls
Yeah.
themselves specifically. And it's just an aside. The other
Yeah.
question I have
So interesting.
for you is, you mentioned earlier in this discussion that Gola was named later.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, when we actually see that name, Teng Gola, when is it written and under what kinds of sort of political conditions?
Yeah. Well, so like there are earlier references to, as I said, a citadel that is associated with Anzung Buong, but it is not named Gola. And this is from the Shui Jingzhu, the commentary on the classic waterways, which is like a geographical treatise that talks about like this river and that river and what it's around, and they call in that text, again, this is one of those things where some smart person who's listening is going to correct me. So God bless you, whoever you are, future person. But I think it's like I think it's called either Viet Tang like the citadel, like the walled city of the Viet people,
Yeah.
or maybe it might even be associated with that term Viet Tuam, which is a classical term for southern kingdom.
Okay.
Viet Chang. And also, I know that another term that is used, I think, in the classic of waterways uh, tadpole citadel, Khadao Tang, something like that.
What century is that?
So the classic of waterways is from the 6th century, and I will say shout out to Liam Kelly because he did a lot of this
Oh, yeah.
excavation work early on. But the classic of waterways is from the 6th century, and it cites an older text that's specifically about Zhao, which is lost. So
Okay.
and that it was presumably closer to the period of time of Gola,
Right.
you know, probably
Okay.
Han Dynasty time. But so that text describes Anzungvung, and it also describes a city or like a fortification, but it does not call it Gola. So the term Gola is only found in the 15th century.
Okay.
So that's Lei Dynasty, 15th
Yeah.
century.
Yeah.
In when it's called Luochang for the first, like Luatang, and then eventually Gola.
Okay.
And then I think it's in the 15th century text where it's given this etymology of like 9
Right.
layers of spiral
Okay.
main walls. Yeah.
So I have an observation and a question about that, right? I'll start with the observation. The 9 walls, right? The snail shape.
Yeah.
My colleagues and I, this is Russ Quick and others. Russ and I went to grad school together. We worked with the same professor. We had the same advisor, Larry Keeley. Russ and I have been looking at Gola for a few years now. And he pointed this out to me from LiDAR imagery and satellite photos and all this stuff and on-the-ground surveys that we've been doing, where he thinks he can see 9 walls or the remains of 9 walls.
Shut up. For real? Because I always thought that was a lie. But keep going.
He thinks you can, if you look hard enough, you can actually see the remains of, because over centuries, much of that has disappeared, right? It's erosion, it's development, people come and go. People have been living there for what, 4,000 years or so.
Yeah.
And so, and even in the last, I would say, couple of decades, parts of the ramparts have been obliterated and roads are cut through, people build gardens and homes, all kinds of stuff. So it's not a surprise, right?
So
but he insists that there are, from the imagery, you can actually see the remains of other constructions, other potential rampart constructions, other parts of it, the larger system. And you could make the argument that maybe it's not exactly 9, but you could get to 9. Yeah. So once he said that, it's very intriguing for me to think about. So that's one observation. I'll let you respond to that in a second. But the other question I have before I forget, when we hear about Ngo Quyen.
Oh, yeah.
And according to what I've read, Ngo Quyen decides, and I think Keith Taylor actually says this in some of his work, Ngo Quyen decides to avoid the Hanoi area and the remains of the Chinese fortress, right? That eventually become part of Tanglong, the Tanglong Citadel. And instead, he goes across the river, chooses the old kingdom, the old site of Gola as his seat of power. Maybe because there are echoes of a distant ancestor, or maybe it's a political ploy to show I am the legitimate, descendant of these pre-Han, pre-Sinitic kings, or whatever the political messaging might have been. But what I'm curious about is, if that actually is described, what did they call the site at that point?
Oh, damn, that's a good question. That's a good question. So let me respond to you the 9 thing first, because that's so interesting and cool. So I had 2 thoughts immediately. First of all, like I mean, the number 9, whenever you have a layer of something, like the Chinese word is a layer, like layers of clouds, layers of mountains, layers of whatever, it's always 9. Like even Samgyu Lam is 9, right? There are 9 tributaries of the Mekong, so it's always 9. So I have always thought, and I tend still to think that description is expressive.
Yeah.
It's poetic as opposed to deliberate. But I do think, but when you say there are 9 layers of something, what you really mean is there are multitudinous layers of it, right? So what you just said makes a lot of sense to me. If when we imagine what it must have looked like, if there are thousands of years of ramparts, then destroyed ramparts, and then rebuilt ramparts, maybe it did just look like there were just a bunch of layers, a bunch of layers
Yeah.
of walls to give it this particular kind of spiraling look.
Yeah.
So,
Or maybe
that
they were inspired to actually make it 9, and maybe some of those
Or
subsequent walls were
also
added
true.
over the years so that they could get to that number.
True, yeah, because
we
they
don't know the
wanted it
answer
to
to
be 9. Yeah. Although literally 9 means many, like that's
Yeah.
what it means.
Okay.
So, but that was fascinating. I'd love to read the report by your
Well,
colleague about.
we haven't published that yet.
Oh, right. Oh,
We're very behind on things.
me too. My God, look at my desk. It's but so the question about Ngo Quyen. So I don't remember. I think that is in what. So I actually it's so funny because I wrote Keith because we had talked like a week or two ago about the fact that Keith mentions this anecdote of Ngo Quyen moving the capital across the river.
Yeah.
And he notes that it's this is the site of Gola. So I wrote him. I was like, I just talked to Nam Kim, like, yeah, blah, 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 blah. I did not ask him what the site is called, and I would have to look at the historical record again and or ask Keith to know the term, but it's definitely not Gola. It's not that. My guess right now is either it is one of those terms from the 6th century,
Yeah.
or it maybe even something like the citadel of Anzengwang. That's a possibility. Or it's just like across the river, because Gola is literally just across the river from Tumbing, which is the capital.
Yeah.
So, but that's an excellent question. So, stay tuned. You guys. Come back and listen. But yeah,
the implication is that he was quite aware of those histories and of those stories.
Yes. But so in the conversation I had with Keith, so Keith reminded me of this article that he wrote many, many years ago on the 12 lords. So the period in the Vietnamese historical record of the 10th century, is called the chaos of the 12 lords, or the rebellion of the 12 lords. And it's a period in which Keith does some really interesting work about whether there are actually 12 lords or whether there is just like it's another figure of speech to describe the fragmentation of Annam at this time.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, we have a fragmentation of Annam at this time. And one of the things that Keith, I think, very brilliantly describes is the success of Ngo Quyen being based on his capacity to unite the different fragments of Annam. So the upland, the sort of mountainous periphery to the northwest, which is essentially Gola is the beginning of it, but really Mei Ling is where that is what was called Phan at that time. It's where Phum Hung is from. Then the central area around Tumbing, which is the town capital, which is Hanoi, mid-river. The lower delta is another area. Hoa Lu is another area. All of these areas are fighting now because there's chaos, because the Kup family has kind of faded away, right? There's a power struggle.
Yeah.
And Ngo Quyen is from Pham. He's from the area of the mid-river. He's from the area kind of around Mei Ling, but he has his family ties to the lower river plain, which is the Sinitic heartland. And he was also, if I remember Professor Taylor's work correctly, like he was also made a governor or like a magistrate of the lower provinces, which is Ai and Dien, which is Nghệ An and Thanh Hóa today. So he, just as a person, had all of these personal ties to the different regions of Annam. And what Keith is arguing is that his success in becoming the king of Annam is that he mobilized those connections to gather support across the divisions, and that maybe his decision to move out of Tumbing, out of the town capital, was motivated somehow to appease one of these factions. Also, I think one should note that it is moving closer to his home area, which is in Pham. So but I don't think that means that it doesn't have anything to do with Anzengwang. He could have, that might have been one of the reasons why a particular faction wanted him to move there. So I think it's all possible, but the overall spirit of the moment is that it's a deeply factionalized province, and Ngo Quyen is uniting them somehow, but not necessarily uniting them in an anti-Semitic way, is what I
Right.
would say.
Right.
You know,
But
because
just finding
yeah.
finding common elements and
Yeah.
threads.
And you know, always with Ngo Quyen, and you see this repeated with Ding Bo Ling, and you see it repeated with Li Taitou. Like always, the most important factions, the most powerful factions, are the Red River Plain factions, and those people have been Sinitic peoples. You know, a regional Sinitic people for essentially 1,000 years. So
Yeah.
always, even when Ding Bo Ling moves to Hualu, because he, Professor Taylor argues this, he moves that partly because he doesn't feel comfortable. He doesn't feel like he fits in enough with the Red River Plain, but then he has to cater to the Red River Plain, and culturally cater to them. So,
Yeah.
and then of course, Li Taitou is from the Red River Plain. He is a
Yeah.
Red River Plain person. So,
Yeah.
you see this
fascinating.
repeated over and over and again.
And I mean, arguably one of the potential reasons that he moves to Gola, well, we're talking about Ngo Quyen, is the presence of these fortification features, which allows, I mean, it's turnkey, right?
Yeah.
If you are setting up your political capital somewhere and you realize you have to have defensive fortifications as well, maybe much of that's already standing and you can repurpose it fairly quickly. Not to never mind the sort of cultural symbols and meanings attached to that space, that landscape. But now you've got physical attributes as well.
Yeah, well, let me ask you a question, because it reminds me of the question I had before. Because is the technical question is there a way archaeologically to determine like how extensive the ramparts or the walls were at different periods of time? Because again, it is always bothered me that Hai Baching did not set up at Gola.
Yeah.
And yet Ngo Quyen is doing it 1,000 years later, or 900 years later, almost 900 years later. So is there a way to tell? Yeah. Or
Yes,
do we know at all? Yeah.
we have some indications.
Mhm.
Now, there are ways to tell. And this gets back to a comment you made earlier about our lack of funding. If we had all the money in the world, if we had access, we would excavate and excavate and excavate. And we would answer as many questions as we can. The problem is we don't, right? We don't have the luxury of doing that. Not to mention we don't necessarily have the permission to do that, nor maybe would we want to do that. Because actually, when you excavate, you are destroying that context,
Right.
right? You record as much as you can, but you are actually destroying that context. So the simple answer is what we've tried to do, even though my colleagues, 20 years ago when I proposed this idea, they told me, why would you want to do that? We already know that Anzengwen was here. We know what year that was. We know all that information already.
Right.
But my response was, we think we know, but until we have material data, it's hard to know for sure or to have any kind of confidence in that. So why not excavate the wall itself and to recover material remains that might be datable to give us a sense of when that wall might have been built and when this city might have been constructed.
Right.
The problem is we excavated one portion of 3 that we could see. It took several years to get samples from other elements, other parts of the rampart system. So we did do the middle, outer, and inner walls of the 3 that we can see, the extant ones that are still standing. We have, with a fairly high degree of confidence, data that tell us they are built pretty rapidly within the same kind of era. We have similar kinds of material remains within them. Very specifically, the roof tiles of Gola.
Yeah.
We also have stylistic similarities between certain kinds of artifacts. We have relative dates and we have absolute dates from radiocarbon, from thermoluminescence, and other kinds of dating techniques. The larger thrust here is that it does appear, at least from the samples that we have, right, those 3 excavations, which took a decade or more to do, indications that there was one system in place. Someone, whether it was Anzengbrung or somebody else, I can't say for sure, someone or some entity was responsible for planning and then carrying out this construction project that resulted in this monumental system of fortifications.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, it's very difficult to know if the entire system was built in exactly the same way at the same exact time. This is our current hypothesis. This is the best guess that we have.
And if I remember your book correctly, did you say that there's some indication that there's another moment of like raising the walls higher, or like there's something like that, right? There's some
Yeah, definitely.
evidence for that.
There is evidence of refurbishment or
Mhm.
amplification phases,
Okay, yeah.
and they occur centuries after. So our best guess is that the earliest that we see some of the monumental features. Now, even in the middle wall that we excavated, there might have been smaller walls underneath
Mm.
from a couple centuries earlier. And there was Đông Sơn pottery associated with that. And we have radiocarbon dates for those smaller constructions.
Oh, interesting.
So it's very possible that let's hypothesize. Let's pretend Anzangbung was real. Let's just call it Anzangbung's time.
Yeah.
It's possible that during the time of Anzangbung, there were already different communities here building walls,
Mhm.
maybe on a much smaller scale. And someone comes along and on a much larger scale builds right over the top of them, extends and builds this monumental system that we have come to know as Tenkolwa
Yeah.
during around the 3rd century BCE. So not that far off from what the legends say,
Yeah,
because they say
exactly
what,
the right time.
258, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
But we do see even beyond that into the Common Era, even into maybe like the 10th century, episodes of further construction.
Yeah. So this is exactly why I'm like, why did the Trung sisters not use Gola? I have two mysteries in my head about Gola, and we didn't like. I really wanted to talk to Nam about Gola and Anzangbung, so maybe we have to do another episode.
Yeah,
but
I was just gonna say we're like coming up on the time that I know that you guys both have to go. So I just want I can keep going, but I think maybe John, we save that for part 2.
Okay.
What do you think? Yeah.
Sure.
You know, why don't you tease out your question so we can have it on record, and then
Okay.
we'll pick it up on the next episode with Nam.
Well, I think the mystery is the mismatch of the historical record of Gola and the material record, because from what I understand, given Nam's book, there is incredibly rich material evidence for a huge urban or agrarian urban, I think is what you call it, site there. And as I mentioned earlier, there's through Nanyue, even through the Trung sisters, there's not even an indication in the Han all the way through the Han record of a single major fortification. There are mentions of walled towns and things like that, but there's not why would you not describe this single large fortification, right? So that's like, for me, it's such a confusion. I think it makes more sense for Nanyue, because as I said, the Han could not penetrate the interior of Nanyue, like they didn't know.
Yeah.
So they really might not have known that there was this big city down there. But in the Han times, it's very confusing to me. And then we get to Ngo Quyen, and then later periods. So that's part of what I want to ask about. And also I want to, there's so much we need to talk about with regard to the legends and the actual artifacts, crossbows, to put in a single word. So we should talk about that next time.
Well, that question that you started with, I have not thought about this, and it is now very, very interesting to me. Why the Trung sisters would not have made use of Goloa, or her. I mean, did they ever visit? Did they know about it? I don't. I'm not sure about that. But we might. I wonder if it's tied to the other parts of the legends about Nam Viet. And the transfer of the magic crossbow and the invasion and the takeover of Gola, right? I don't know, and I would want to ask you about that as well. So maybe the next time we get together, we talk about all of those sorts of archaeological and historical details. Compare notes.
Yeah, that was awesome, because I really thought we were going to talk about Gola today, and then we just like hi Bacheng. Yeah, so
this is good. This is really good. If anyone in the audience has more questions, please leave it in the comments. We will attempt to pick questions that show up over and over in the comment section, and then we'll start to approach John's questions and really get into Gola on the next episode. I think we have to do part 2, right?
I'm down. That sounds like fun. This was super fun. It was so fun.
Yeah. Nam, John, thank you both so much, and we will pick this back up. Thank you so much.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, both of you.
Yeah,
It's
thanks
awesome.
both.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.